Hi, my name is Mary Rigney. I am a professor of history at Elizabethtown Community and Technical College, and I'm participating in Decolonizing the Curriculum presented by the Arts and Humanities Division. And I'm going to give you a presentation about systemic racism in the United States from 1865 to close to the present time. I'm not going to talk about current events because my thing, my topic, my discipline is history. So I don't want to get into modern, like now, politics, but we are going to see things that generally we talk about in my History 109 class, which starts at the end of the Civil War. It starts with Reconstruction and comes up, again, close to modern times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take you through and show you some things that have happened throughout American history that makes it very difficult, if you stop and think about it, for you to say, well, I didn't own any slaves, or my family didn't own any slaves, or nobody alive here was a slave. Why don't they just get over slavery? That's something I hear sometimes from people. And it always is disturbing because I try to explain in my History 109 class, the one that I'm sort of, building upon here. I try to explain to people that it wasn't just as if slavery ended one day and everything was fine and everybody's just, okay, we're all good with it. That's not how it went. So we're going to talk about something that's called systemic racism, sometimes called institutional racism. Sometimes the terms are, kind of used interchangeably. And I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to give a working definition of racism. There's a book I've been reading called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and I found a great definition that she has in there. Quote, social scientists often define racism as the combination of racial bias and systemic power, seeing racism like sexism as primarily the action of people or systems with personal or group power over another person or group with less power. Okay, now I'm going to give you a little bit more of a definition now, specifically about systemic racism. Now, I got this from a document called the Out of Africa Monologues. It's posted by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, systemic or institutional racism can be defined as the racial attitudes found in an ethnic group's traditions, beliefs, opinions, and myths that are firmly ingrained in the very fiber of the ethnic group's cultural paradigm, where such traditions, beliefs, opinions, and myths have been practiced and sustained for so long that they are accepted as common facts, understood to be normal behavioral practices, whereas such practices in effect marginalize and demonize the human worth of another ethnic group. Everyday American Europeans practice racist concepts and beliefs that are firmly embedded in American culture, though they themselves may be ignorant of how such practices, myths, opinions, and beliefs are connected to racism and to white supremacy concepts. I think people do that every day. Okay, that's why it's called institutional or systemic racism, is that it's so deeply ingrained that most people who are not members of marginalized groups don't even realize it's happening because it feels normal. It's been normalized to that extent. Now, we're going to go back here and we're going to start in 1865, and we're starting with the Reconstruction era. Now, the Civil War ended in 1865, and Reconstruction is the name we give to the period that followed the Civil War. It's going to be really short. It's only going to go from 1865 to 1877. And this is not enough time to heal from the wounds of the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War didn't just happen overnight. there were so many things that led up that's further back than where we're going, but there were so many things that led to the Civil War. And the idea of slavery was at the heart of so much of that we can't take an institution, slavery, which was called sometimes by Southern historians today who study that time period, who study the antebellum period, or who study, basically the Old South and American slavery. Sometimes we hear it called the peculiar institution. Okay, slavery had been around since, the early 1600s in the United States in one form or another. And the transcontinental slave trade and all of that. So the idea that in the North people were ending slavery, while in the South there were people who were still really dependent upon slavery economically, especially, that's kind of driving a wedge between really the regions of the country at that time, North and South, for a very long time. Okay, a very long time. Now, Reconstruction, again, as we're trying to heal from all of those wounds, especially the Civil War that ensued, 12 years is not enough. And we have approximately 4 million Black men and women coming out of slavery, and they need to adjust to a new life of freedom. But how are they going to do that? It's a good question, right? Now, the government kept a military presence in the former Confederate states in the South for a while. And why they did that was to go down and protect the rights of the former slaves and to try to help them with basic needs, really. Besides navigating the new world of freedom, you have to talk about practicalities. We had something called the Freedmen's Bureau, which was set up as I think it was set up in 1863, before maybe 1864, before the war actually ended. But the Freedmen's Bureau was an agency of the Army, and it was run by General Oliver O. Howard. And part of what the Freedmen's Bureau did was it literally tried to help the former slaves and some poor white people get food, shelter, clothing, basic needs, right? But the government's going to keep this military presence down there to try to help in many ways. But again, big goal here is to protect the rights of the former slaves and to help them start anew with their lives. Now, this era is going to see really important questions that are raised, especially, about who are we as Americans? Where are we going from here? Now, we're going to have questions like, who is a citizen? What rights do citizens have? The major Reconstruction issues are going to revolve around things like citizenship, but also voting rights. Who's allowed to vote? What's the criteria for voting? I mean, how are we going to make these decisions as a country, and where's that going to lead us? And violence, as the South refused to accept the loss in the Civil War, but mostly the end of slavery, because again, it was so deeply ingrained in the South. We're going to see that the major issues from Reconstruction, all of those things and many more, do not end in 1877. Now, those issues are going to provide the foundation for a lot of what we see today presenting as systemic racism. Now, after being freed, former slaves generally had no education. Why is that? Can we look at them and say, oh, well, they weren't smart enough to have an education? No, of course not. There were laws in the South that made it illegal to teach slaves to read and to write. Okay, so why? I always ask my classes, why do you think that was the case? Well, because knowledge is power. And the more knowledge you have, the more likely you are to question. And the more you question, the more you might be uncomfortable with your situation. And the more you're going to want to fight back against injustice as your world opens. So they generally had no education, no property, and no means of providing for themselves. Now, what happened in 1865 was there was a special order called, or special field order, specifically number 15, by the Union General William Sherman. Okay. Now, Sherman's going to call for confiscation of property from the Confederates and redistribution to the former slaves. Now, this was a way to give them a chance to own land, with the land, that was going to be given to the former slaves not exceeding 40 acres. So that's where we kind of get this saying, if you've ever heard 40 acres and a mule. Okay. Now, some people, there is a little bit of disagreement as to whether or not Sherman meant for that to be permanent. Okay, permanent giving the land to the freedmen to give them a fresh start. But a lot of historians say, yes, that's exactly what he meant. Now, it was meant to help around 20,000 Black families get a start as freedmen, women, children, and families. Special Field Order 15, though, was nullified by President Andrew Johnson, who came into the presidency as Abraham Lincoln's vice president upon the death of Abraham Lincoln when he was assassinated in April of 1865. Now, President Andrew Johnson is going to return the land that was confiscated to many of these former Confederates if they took a loyalty oath to the United States. Now, Johnson's going to offer amnesty to a lot of these former Confederates, and he's going to allow many of them to even regain their power, serving in government, local government, but also in the federal government. Okay, so Johnson, his form of Reconstruction was very different than what a lot of people in Congress had wanted, particularly what we call the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans really wanted to ensure that the former slaves would be treated fairly and equally, and they were very much in favor of disenfranchising, removing the right to vote from the Confederates, the people who had aided and abetted the Confederacy, not just the high-ranking Confederates. So they were not on board with what Andrew Johnson was presenting here when he basically nullified this order to give 40 acres to the freedmen. But there was not much Congress could do about that at the time. Now, what we see coming up here are we're going to have, during this period, 3 Reconstruction amendments that are very important to the way the country is going to move forward. Okay. Now, it's arguable how much effect some of these had at the time. We're going to talk about that. But the 13th Amendment is what legally freed the slaves, okay, ratified by the end of 1865. And the 13th Amendment, instead of the Emancipation Proclamation, but the 13th Amendment is what actually made it illegal to have slavery in the United States. Now, in order for the troops that had, or not the troops, I'm sorry, but the states that had seceded from the Union, in order for them to rejoin the Union, they had to accept these Reconstruction amendments. Now, of course, some of them are going to do it under great duress. Some of them are not going to accept them until much later. If you're interested, go look up when Kentucky, when Tennessee, when some other states, when they actually ratified themselves, when they actually accepted some of these Reconstruction amendments from the 1800s. Now, 13th Amendment freed the slaves, ratified pretty quickly. The 14th Amendment is going to be the Citizenship Amendment. Now, this is where we have the former slaves being recognized as citizens. Now, there's a lot more to that. There's a lot more to all of these amendments. I'm just giving you the basic things here. But there's also something in here called the Equal Protection Clause, which guarantees equality under the law. That's been used for many different cases, throughout American legal history. But this was particularly at that time referencing and used at that time, you know, in the ensuing years that come right after that, for equality for former slaves, for the most part. Now, it was ratified in 1868. 15th Amendment is the third of these three Reconstruction amendments, and this is the one that probably had the least effect for a long, long time, okay? 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. Now, this is the first time, if I'm not mistaken, that we have the mention of gender in the Constitution, gave Black men the right to vote, okay? Regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That should have been enough, okay? It was ratified in 1870, but I just told you it didn't really have much of an effect. Why not? We're going to hear more about this in a few minutes. But the 15th Amendment didn't go far enough. I mean, that's basically it. It didn't go far enough because many Black men are going to be denied the right to vote because it said you can't deny them the right to vote for race, color, previous condition of servitude. That left a lot of loopholes out there. So we see in the South, Black men are being denied the right to vote, even though you have this amendment. They're going to be denied the right to vote due to things like, hey, we want you to pay to vote, poll taxes, okay? We want to see if you can read and write, literacy test, okay? We want to make sure that you own a certain amount of property to prove that you're invested enough that you need the right to vote. Okay, so there were all kinds of roadblocks that were there, and those are not going to go away for a very long time, as we'll see. Now, the Black Codes are going to come out right as the Civil War ended. Okay, because what's happening here is in 1865, when the war ended, and then 1866, we start to see these laws passed across the South to keep Black men especially, but both Black men and women are affected, in a subordinate inferior position. As a group, we refer to these laws as the Black Codes. Now, the economy of the Old South had rested on and grown prosperous through free labor. Okay, when you remove slavery from the picture, you have removed their free labor, and that's going to just crash the economy of the South. If you look at the South immediately after the Civil War and immediately as slavery was ending, you're going to see the South was desolate, destitute. Okay, what's going to happen down there? Well, there's a lot of reasons we could talk about things they could have done before the Civil War that would have made it much easier on them in the South, and maybe they wouldn't have even thought of seceding or whatever, but that's in the past, right? The loss of free labor, though, is going to lead to this new type of legal bondage, okay? Now, we're going to see a lot of former slaves in the post-Civil War era that are going to be under these Black Codes because they're going to spread throughout the South pretty quickly. And these laws are meant to restrict the freedoms down to things like how they can travel. Can Black men and women go from one place to the other? Well, they're free. So what? The Black Codes are going to say, we don't care. We're going to continue to keep them in this box where they are, subordinate to us. So these laws are a means to restrict the freedoms of the former slaves. Now, for one thing, they were forbidden from a First Amendment right, in terms of, or Second Amendment right, rather, in terms of firearms. They were forbidden from owning firearms. Black Codes are going to prevent Black people from owning or leasing farms. Now, this is one I talk about a lot in my actual classes when we talk about this era and why you can't just say, well, they should just get over slavery. Is a long time ago. Well, watch what's happening here, okay? The Black Codes are preventing the black men and women, from black men mainly, from owning and leasing farms. You can't do that. But at the same time, we have other laws that make it illegal for you to have any other job rather than agriculture. And in some cases, domestic work. That was more aimed toward women. So I can't go get a job doing something other than agricultural work, and I can't own a farm, and I can't even lease a farm. What is happening here? Well, what's happening here is pretty darn clear, okay? What they're doing is they are, again, keeping the black men and women in a specific place. Now, you have debt peonage or debt bondage, which basically, they could take you and say, hey, you know what? You owe me money. I'm going to have you work it off. They could arrest you for not having a job. They hire you out to some guy and work on his farm or whatever. You're not allowed to leave, and it's basically you're not going to be free at that point. You're over here in someone else's farm working for them because you've been arrested, and that's your punishment. Okay. Sharecroppers. Now, sharecroppers and tenant farms or sharecroppers and tenant farming, sharecroppers are going to work for someone else. Okay, a lot of black men are going to end up becoming sharecroppers. Now, they're going to contribute their labor only. That's it. They have no legal claim to the land or to the land they work or to the crops they grow. They have no choice in what they're going to grow, and so on. Okay. Now, tenant farmers, this is a very close thing to sharecroppers, but tenant farmers are usually going to own some things. Usually they're going to own some animals, some equipment, some supplies. The tenant farmers are usually going to be paying rent to the owner of the farm, and they're going to get usually a house, and they're going to get some land, and they're going to make their own decisions about the crops. Okay, so that's the difference between those two. And then convict leasing would be, similar to what I was mentioning earlier, where you could arrest someone for something. Maybe it's just a made-up charge. Who's going to be above the law, right? At that point, if you're arresting former slaves, you're saying, well, this guy committed a crime. It's a very different world, right? Very different world. So they could say, well, you're going to have to serve a sentence, but we're not going to put you in jail. Or if they do put you in jail or whatever, you're going to say, okay, you've been in jail. We're going to now send you over there to work for whoever on his farm, his plantation or whatever. You see what they're doing, right? It's very obvious. Now, the black codes were used, as I said, to continue this free labor and help the Southern economy. And vagrancy laws are widespread. Now, vagrancy just means that you don't have a job. Okay, it's not a word we hear much today. But states in the black codes were going to criminalize men who were out of work. So again, that gave them an excuse. We arrest you, put you in jail. We send you over to this guy to work for who knows how long, right? Now, you had 9 Southern states that updated their vagrancy laws in this period from 1865, 1866. 8 of the 9 states allowed this convict leasing. It's incredible, right? Convicts just being hired out. Free labor, free labor. Now, to nullify the black codes, we have what a lot of people don't know, the first civil rights law passed in 1866. Okay, and again, this is to nullify, knock out the black codes. Now, it was passed by Congress, and President Johnson vetoed it twice, but Congress overrode it, and it became law. Now, the Civil Rights Law, 1866, gave the federal government the right to intervene in state affairs. Okay, we can come into the state if someone has had their civil rights violated, to protect citizens, basically, right? So it didn't provide, though, some really important things. It didn't provide penalties for discrimination in certain things like denying housing, denying employment, and other things that we're going to also see in a few minutes. Now, Reconstruction, as I said, Reconstruction is very short. Reconstruction is going to end in 1877. Why? Obviously, we've still got problems. Why is it ending? Well, 1876 election was crazy. It was one of the closest, if not the closest, presidential election in American history. Okay, so the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes became president. We think there was an informal compromise. Sometimes we call it the Compromise of 1877 that ended Reconstruction. Now, Hayes agreed to be a one-term president. Okay, he's a Republican. Now, Republicans at that time, the Republican Party, especially what we call the radical Republicans, were the ones who were fighting to get equality for the former slaves. Okay, so what he, his party, I guess, what deal they probably made, the compromise they made was okay. Okay, we're going to allow the Democratic governments in the South. The Democrats had controlled the South. Okay, solid South. The Democrats of that time were the party of slavery of that time. Okay, and Hayes agreed to remove the federal troops. Oh, remember I mentioned that the federal troops were down there to help the freedmen and some of the poor whites that needed help, to be honest. So help with equality and getting a fresh start and everything. Oh, he agreed to basically get rid of the federal troops and give control of the South back to the Democrats who had it before in the South. This is considered the official end of Reconstruction. Now, as president, Hayes is going to refuse to enforce the federal civil rights protections. Even worse, right? Without federal oversight, the South is going to devolve back into, well, as close as they could get to slavery, really. Okay, the southern states are going to replace the black codes, which had been nullified, recall. They're going to do something a little bit different, but mostly the same. Okay, even broader reaching. They're going to basically replace the black codes with Jim Crow laws. Okay, Jim Crow era is coming. Black men and women had little recourse legally in the South. Again, if they go to the legal system, the legal system is going to be full of very white people who may or may not have sympathy for them. Congress had stripped the 14th and 15th Amendments of law, their significance. The Supreme Court had been making rulings that prevented the government, say, hey, the government can't discriminate. The government can't do this, but private corporations and organizations and individuals, they can discriminate as long as it's not the government. That removes a lot of teeth from some of that, right? Hotels, railroads, theaters, they're all going to practice, and so many more, legal segregation. At that time, separation of black and white people just in society. Now, after Reconstruction officially ended, we see that most Southerners are going to be determined to, as I said, regress back as close as they could get to slavery. Now, the government's been giving away free land to poor white men who went out to settle in the West. This is called the Homestead Act of 1862, which provided 160 acres of public land to those who migrated west. Now, that's going to be a thing that was happening for white men. We saw the proposal back there. We saw the idea that, okay, we could take land. Remember, you had Sherman's idea, Sherman's command there that we were going to confiscate land from the Confederates and give it to former slaves, redistribute it out. Some of that did happen in the South, remember, but most of the land was restored. Andrew Johnson. All right. Now, what we see here also, after Reconstruction, pretty soon voter suppression, again, due to those loopholes in the 15th Amendment, Jim Crow segregation, we just mentioned, and we're going to talk about more, and then terrorism against Black people. KKK and other white terrorist organizations are going to get their start back here in this era, and it's going to be terrifying. So what about the Jim Crow laws? Now, Southern states, again, I always tell my students, repetition is good. It helps you remember it. Okay. Southern states replaced the black codes with what became called, what they came to call Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow, the name was taken from a minstrel character, supposedly, and also, there were some other things you could look up about the naming, but it was never never a nice thing. Jim Crow was always an insult. Okay, that term, that name for anything. Now, in 1890, we have a case in Louisiana that's going to be really important. The Louisiana General Assembly is going to pass a law to prevent Black and white people from riding together on railroads. Okay, so what happens then is we have a case in 1896 that comes before the Supreme Court. Plessy v. Ferguson. Okay, this is one of the big landmark cases in American history. Now, Plessy v. Ferguson is going to challenge this law. Okay, and what happens is you have a man named Homer Plessy, and he was 1/8, I believe, African, had African blood. 1/8 was I think what it was. And anyway, he had gone into the white car on the railroad and basically had announced the fact that he had 1/8 African blood. And they're like, hey, you need to go to the colored car, as they would have called it back then, which kind of illustrated how ridiculous that was, right? So anyway, he sues. Okay, this was a test case, really. And the court said, well, it's okay. Louisiana General Assembly law, this is fine, they said. The Supreme Court said that public facilities for Blacks and whites can be separate as long as they are equal. That's where we get separate but equal. Okay. Now, throughout the South, this is going to lead to, again, the Jim Crow law spreading out even further and further, and legalized segregation going from everything, from water fountains to balconies in theaters, movie theaters. When we get movie theaters later and we've still got Jim Crow laws, or back then, just theaters where you go to watch plays, Black folks and white folks would have completely different areas to sit in, just different things. Again, we've probably all seen the pictures of the water fountains. That's some of the most famous ones. But in 1898, the Supreme Court of the United States took another case. Now, this case is called Williams v. Mississippi. And basically, this case was really important as well, okay, because it empowers the Southern states to really go out there and prevent Black men from voting, okay? So Williams v. Mississippi, this law, there's a Mississippi law that was designed to deny Black men the right to vote. And when that law was upheld, the Southern states were like, so we can charge a poll tax. Oh, if we want to do literacy tests, well, the Supreme Court has given us the okay as of now, okay? So property requirements. And then we have things like grandfather tests and so on. Now look at what happens, okay? In 1896, Louisiana had 130,334 registered Black voters. 8 years later, only 1,342, 1% of those Black men in Louisiana could pass the new state voting restrictions with all those roadblocks up to disenfranchise them and deny them the vote. Now, many of these laws, to me, seem like histrionic overreactions to black and white people's interactions. For example, in Georgia, black and white folks were not allowed to use the same outdoor parks. Blacks and whites could not play checkers together, for heaven's sake. In Birmingham, Alabama, according to a law in 1930, okay, Jim Crow lasted a very long time, remember. These laws are going to control the interactions between the races, and they were deeply embedded after a period of time. Now, blacks who violated these laws could be beaten by whites, and no one would hold the white men who beat the black men accountable. Okay. Lynchings were not uncommon during the Jim Crow era. KKK had kind of faded away a little bit for a while, but they returned with a vengeance in the 1920s, the 19 teens. There's a movie that comes out, I believe it was 1915, called Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffiths, which it's this really amazing movie, because what it does is it takes American history and shows what you can do if you use propaganda. It takes the KKK and makes them sort of the heroes of the story of America. So that movie had come out in 1915. President Woodrow Wilson is going to show that in the White House. Okay. But by the 1920s, the KKK has come back in full force. Now, in the 20s, it was partially driven by the large number of immigrants. We had an enormous period of immigration in this period from the late 1800s up through the early 1900s. We have about, I believe it's 25 million or so people coming in from different places that they had not really seen people coming from before, places like Russia, the Slavic countries, and so on. So anyway, the movement, that the return of the KKK was perhaps reborn, due to immigration, but black men and women, of course, were still targets, as well as many other marginalized groups out there. Now, World War I's coming. Now, World War I, everything's going to be great by World War I, right? No, okay. World War I starts for the United States April of 1917, when we declare war, join. Okay. Now, the war had been going on since August of 1914 at this time. But Black Americans are going to question the lack of racial equality in their country after World War I, during and after World War I, because so many Black men had stepped up and joined the military because they wanted to serve their country. But some of them had great hopes. A lot of them were happily showing the fact that they were patriots. They loved the United States of America. Some of them were thinking that they might be rewarded with equality once they showed how much they respected and loved the country. But the segregation they found in the military was the same as it was every day, whether you are in the uniform of an American fighting man or not. Okay, so Black military men were not allowed to serve in the Marines. In the Navy, they were allowed jobs like cooks, just very menial jobs, not combat roles. For the most part, there were a few. I don't know though if any of them really ever saw combat. I don't remember. Now, African Americans had to fight even to get a Black officer training program. Finally, they got that, but they had segregated training camps. Now, racial tension is going to increase when they came home, because the Black soldiers had this bigger view of the world, and they saw that, the political and social rights that we have, that this is not fair. We're talking about democracy. What about us, right? So again, in the South and the North, white people questioned if this dynamic was changing and whether racial equality for Black men and women was actually coming. And fear leads to violence sometimes. So the summer of 1919, due to fear of perhaps Black equality, we see race riots across the United States. Okay, several cities. We're going to see the number of lynchings of Black Americans, 76 by the end of 1919, with several Black veterans being lynched. Some of them were still in uniform, man, come on. So we had highly esteemed civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson basically calling this the Red Summer. Okay. Black Americans saw that this was going to be a really hard fight because the more gains Black Americans made, the harder the old system pushed back and kept them down. Okay. But they didn't give up. And the Great Migration is going to start around World War I, right around the same time, where we have many Black families leaving what a lot of people say, why did so many former slaves stay in the South? Well, they did for quite a while, yes. But here's where they start to leave in large numbers. Okay, leaving this racially oppressive social and political environment of the South, heading up north, because we have a lot of industrial jobs in the cities up north. Okay, part of it had come about because of World War I industry. Now we have at least 500,000 African Americans migrated to places in the north, Chicago, New York, Detroit, and others. Okay, so the Great Migration from the South is going to last throughout the 1940s. Now, World War II is coming. Yeah, there's the period between the wars where we have the Great Depression and other things going on. But World War II, here's another significant moment. When the United States entered World War II, just like World War I, many Black men wanted to fight for their country. But just like World War I, Jim Crow segregation and discrimination was prevalent throughout the military. Okay. Military bases, Black soldiers were segregated in every possible way. There were separate blood banks, hospitals, if not hospitals, if there was just one hospital, there were separate wards where they would put Black, injured Black soldiers, medical staff, separate barracks, separate recreational facilities, everything. Segregation was still everywhere. Now, across the country, you saw white soldiers and local white residents at military bases harassing them, routinely harassing them. Now, I'm going to quote right here from a history professor at Dartmouth College, Matthew Delmott. He says, the experience was very dispiriting for a lot of Black soldiers. The kind of treatment they received by white officers and army bases in the United States was horrendous. They described being in slave-like conditions and being treated like animals. They were called racial epithets quite regularly and just not afforded respect either as soldiers or as human beings. Still, the Black servicemen were kept in subordinate positions, mostly labor service unions, cooks, building roads, digging ditches. And if a Black man became an officer, they could only lead other Black men. Okay, many white military leaders did not want Black men to carry weapons. So you see where we are, right? Subordination. After World War II, we have a few things going on. We have the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, commonly known as the GI Bill. Now, this is a law that provides benefits for World War II veterans, and the law is to help veterans come back into civilian life and be successful. Okay, it's going to help them with mortgages and loans and financial assistance, including college. Now, this is going to help a lot of white Americans. However, the Black Americans didn't get nearly as much of this. Now, the gap between the white veterans who are getting all of these breaks and the Black men veterans who are not getting as much in terms of help from the government, it's going to drive these gaps in employment, education, and wealth much deeper, okay, and much further, and the chasm grows, right? Now, most Black veterans, as I said, did not receive these benefits. And when they returned, they had more trouble finding jobs than their white counterparts. They were sometimes denied vocational training, like electricity, plumbing, or whatever, because there wasn't enough equipment to have a school for the Black soldiers and a school for the Black veterans and a school for the white veterans. It's mind-blowing to us today in the 21st century. I hope it's mind-blowing to me. So African Americans were given a disproportionate share when we look back of dishonorable discharges. Okay, according to some studies that I read, 21% for whites and 39% for Blacks. Okay, now what that does is that takes away your benefits of things like the GI Bill, and also makes it a lot harder for you to get a job with a dishonorable discharge. Jim Crow is still holding tight to its grip on the United States, particularly the South. Okay. Now, the Civil Rights era, post-World War II, we see the continuation of the effects of systemic racism on African Americans. Okay, Black men and women who had migrated from the South didn't just go and completely escape systemic racism. It's not possible. We're still in the same country, right? So economic opportunities for Blacks were still at the lowest status and less likely to lead to an actual career as opposed to a dead-end job. In the housing market, stronger discriminatory measures were going to be used in correlation more to people of color coming up into the northern and the western cities even. Okay, it's spread, okay, the discrimination. Now, Black veterans after both world wars continued to fight back and ask for more civil rights. And a lot of them are going to go and get involved in activist movements. Okay, a lot of them are going to be involved in the civil rights movements. Now, in 1948, President Harry Truman actually did something really important. Okay, he signed an executive order ending segregation in the military. But just like what happens most of the time when they made some gains, there was a backlash of some sort. Now, in the period after World War II, again, throughout most of the United States, Black men and women were forced either by law or by informal discrimination to live in segregated conditions, attend segregated schools, suffer discrimination in public facilities, be it, water fountains and bathrooms and theater, whatever you can think of, take less desirable jobs, face higher unemployment, and live on incomes that were often less than half of whites. Okay, in the South, Black men and women faced an extreme racial etiquette requiring constant deference to the whites, okay, all the time. Okay, you were subordinate, still, okay? Now, resistance brought severe punishment. Yeah, loss of jobs and burned houses. Again, we've got the KKK coming back again in the 50s, really, for the third, incarnation, which I believe is also the present continued incarnation. But you're going to see evictions and mortgage foreclosures, loss of credit, beatings, lynchings, very high in the Black communities. Now, we have an NAACP lawyer, later a federal judge, who concluded that fighting for an end to segregation, that this is necessary to move to broader goals. Okay, he says it was not until Brown was decided that Blacks were able to understand the fundamental vice was not legally enforced, racial segregation itself, that this was more a byproduct, a symptom of the greater and more pernicious disease, white supremacy. Okay, so the Brown case was going to go for the heart of systemic racism. So what's the Brown case? It's Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Okay, and This is the case that was decided in 1954, where we have some defendants. Brown is the name that the plaintiff up here versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And basically, the bottom line of this finding of the Supreme Court in 1954 is the doctrine of separate but equal is inherently unequal because it will make one group or the other feel less than, okay, subordinate. So the struggle to integrate schools now is going to start, and this led to violence. For Southerners, it doesn't just call for an end to segregated schools, it also threatened to them the very foundation of white supremacy or white superiority. Now, what we see here is the negative reaction is going to become massive resistance. We don't want to integrate, they would say. We don't want to bring, or desegregate, as it was sometimes called. Don't want to bring, white children and black children together, they say. Well, May 1956, 101 congressmen issued the Southern Manifesto that said, we pledge ourselves to use all lawful means to bring about a reversal of this decision, which is contrary to the Constitution, and to prevent the use of force in its implementation. Southern leaders and regular white citizens are going to fight this decision. In Little Rock, Arkansas, one of the most famous cases you've probably heard of is the Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School attempt at integration. Okay. Now, you're going to have 9 high school students who are going to enroll in this all-white school, and there's tons of pictures out there of angry mobs throwing things, spitting on the kids as they went in, threats. And the governor, Orville Faubus, is basically like, yeah, we're not going to integrate. These children are trying to just go to school. Finally, President Eisenhower sends in, I believe it's the 101st Airborne, federal troops to protect the students. Each one had a bodyguard as they went into that school. Now, the Little Rock case is famous, but in reality, Brown did not change things everywhere in the South for a long time, okay? Throughout the South, the school officials are going to develop plans to delay and attempt to completely deny implementation of desegregation or integration, including even closing some schools, saying, well, we'll just close the school rather than do that. Now, due to the failure of banks on a large scale to loan money to black mortgage seekers, okay, this is called redlining, based on maps where they would draw lines, literal red lines sometimes, around certain neighborhoods and say, oh, well, this is a bad neighborhood, bad risk, high risk place. We won't finance any houses there. Do this to this redlining here. Many children lived in racially segregated communities. Okay, so civil rights leaders are going to cite the Brown case. They're going to say, okay, this is a moral authority. We have some moral authority here for demonstrations because we're fighting for our rights. We're fighting for our children. Now, at the beginning of the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. alluded to the Brown case. He says, if we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. The success of that boycott, in turn, was facilitated by lawyers who filed suits against bus segregation. Now, it became much bigger, more than just about, the schools. Now it was about, is segregation legal in public facilities and public transportation and so on. It became much bigger. So Brown provided the moral and legal authority. Now, the decision was interpreted by numerous judges as a mandate to get rid of the state-created segregation. And new discrimination cases came to court all the time. We had official segregation in public facilities beginning to end as the cases came, okay? And then we're going to see it throughout most of the southern areas. Okay, now again, Brown is going to still be something that we look at for a lot of people when we talk about Voting rights today are gender equality and equity in sports, freedom from harassment based on gender, sexual orientation, multicultural education, et cetera, international human rights of all kinds, social justice of all kinds. Now, we go into the Emmett Till case, and every time I tell this story, it's always with a very heavy heart because this is a horrible story. But this is also going to push the civil rights movement forward as we see, again, the embedded systemic racism that allows something like this to happen. We have a young 14-year-old black boy from Chicago visiting relatives in Mississippi in the summer of 1955. Okay. And he bought some candy at a little grocery store, and the white woman behind the counter said something. The story changed a couple of times, but she said he either whistled at her or he said, "Hey, baby," or he flirted with her. Okay. Now, truth be told, you may or may not know this, but before she died, she actually admitted he said nothing to her. But I digress. He bought some candy. He was accused of saying something inappropriate to her or doing something inappropriate to her. She told her husband. Her husband and her brother-in-law went to his relative's house, the little boy, 14-year-old boy from Chicago. They kidnapped him. They took him out. They tortured and killed him, dropped his body in the Tallahatchie River. Okay. The all-white jury put them on trial, found them not guilty. Now, the problem was they were guilty. And they went to a magazine very popular at the time called Look magazine, and they admitted they killed him. In the eyes of his murderers, Emmett Till's behavior was not just rude or crude or something like that. To them, as one of these men, one of his murderers said, quote, "It was poison, and it was a threat to their, quote, rights." Now, because of double jeopardy, they could go the rest of their lives talking about how they killed this little boy. Okay, now the systemic understood underlying racism and expectations for submission by black men and women to whites explains why poor little Emmett Till's few moments of interaction with a white woman of any kind in a grocery store could provoke this outrage and just retaliation. Again, very histrionic, just over the top retaliation. Now, to his murderers, he was not from the South, so therefore he hadn't learned his place. Okay, he hadn't learned to be fearful and to submit. He represented to them exactly the type of black person they considered to be out of line. Okay, Emmett Till became a symbol that black people must fight against this continued racism that was so ingrained. Now, systemic racism in housing, we can see that as early as the 1930s. Okay, again, we talked about redlining, and that's what we're talking about here. And we also see that over several decades, white people were moving out to the suburbs, and predominantly black neighborhoods were left to kind of degrade. Retail stores started moving out to the suburbs. Okay, so starting during the New Deal in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration enabled the growth of a lot of white families by providing loan guarantees to banks, which in turn financed white home ownership in the suburbs, which in turn helped them build wealth. This was not usually available to black people. Okay. And as minorities were not able to get financing and aid from banks, white folks are going to pull ahead in equity gains, and college students were then financed with the equity that their families had. They were, in other words, the white families were building wealth. Well, the black families were denied that chance in this case. Again, completely ingrained in the system. Now, the Social Security Act, if we go back a little too, government programs, well, they're not helping any. And go back to the 30s again, Social Security Act of 1935, agricultural workers, domestic servants, and so on, most of whom were black, were excluded from Social Security. Did you know that? In the Wagner Act of 1935, blacks were blocked from law blocked by law rather from challenging the barriers to entry into the newly protected labor unions and securing the right to collective bargaining. They weren't allowed in labor unions. 1935. National Housing Act of 1939. The property appraisal system tied property value and eligibility for government loans to race. Your property value is tied to your race. Okay, again, imagine that. Now, 1960s, taking steps, okay? We're moving forward. 1964, 24th Amendment made poll taxes illegal, okay? In federal elections, poll taxes in state elections were not banned for 2 more years. Can you imagine paying to vote? Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, aimed to overcome the legal barriers at the state and local levels that's preventing the Black people from exercising their right to vote under the 15th Amendment. Remember, there were all those loopholes back there, not just poll taxes, but all the others that we mentioned. Now, this act is going to ban things like literacy tests. It's going to provide for federal oversight of voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population not registered to vote, and authorized the, what is that? Authorized the United States government to come in and oversee these elections. Okay, the Fair Housing Act. Now, this is a really important one because this is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also, very, very important because this introduces federal enforcement mechanisms, okay, in terms of fair housing. Refusal to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of race, color, disability, religion, sex, familial status, or national origin is illegal as of the Civil Rights Act title, Fair Housing Act up there, title, 7. Now, advertising the sale or rental of a dwelling indicating preference of discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin, it's illegal. Now, they've added stuff to that, since then. They've added disabilities and so on since then. So it's kind of a growing thing. But again, we were moving forward. The evidence today, again, beyond, there's so much I had to leave out because there's so much, and I'm still going an hour here. There's so much that we could have dug much more deeply into, and there's so much more that we could have added as we'd come on. But systemic racism is still all around us. We can see it if we look. Okay, that's the problem. We have to know our history, and we have to know that things didn't just end and everything was fine. When slavery was over and the Civil War is over, everybody's happy. That's not reality, okay? Evidence is around us today, now, in the year 2021, okay? We still see segregation in schools, okay? We still see racial gaps in income and wealth, okay? We still see disproportionate number of Black men in the criminal justice system. Black and brown people account for 30% of the U.S. population, okay? Together, Black men, African Americans in general account for, I believe, about 12 to 13% of the population if you just pull them out. But the FBI statistics show that Black and brown people, accounting for 30% of the population, account for 43% of people killed by police. And the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, reports more than half of the incarcerated population. This was as of July 2020. Now, redlining was banned in 1968, but the long-term impact lives on. Black families have simply had less chances to build wealth for their children, okay, to send them then to college. Just all of the things that we see, and also the fact that Black men, and then women finally got the right to vote in 1920, but Black women really aren't getting the right to vote until the 1960s. As amazing as that sounds, right? Truly, and in some places, Black men and women were still not allowed to vote in the 1970s, even after all that was illegal. Okay, so if you don't have the right to vote, you don't have a voice in your government. So the fact that Black men and women did not have a right to vote and were disenfranchised for so long throughout so much of the country shows that obviously that's had an effect. Okay, the laws that were made, they had no say in electing the people in Congress, whether it was local or whether it was federal, that made those laws. Okay, I always tell people in history, if you're looking at, say, grievances that people have, you're looking at rights that they need or they want, I always say probably the first right you should try to get is the right to vote, because without that, your voice is just not heard at all. Okay. Now, redlining, yeah, okay, redlining was banned in 1968. And according to the Federal Reserve, July 2020, the net worth of a typical white family is $171,000, which is fully 10 times greater than that of a Black family. So it's there if you pay attention. Okay, homes in Black neighborhoods are generally and historically worth less than white homes due to lack of the neighborhood, say the businesses, or lack thereof, of businesses that locate there. You're going to see a lot of gentrification these days, which where people come in and start rebuilding parts of neighborhoods that were run down, and you're going to see people with more money then move into those neighborhoods. What happens to the people who are there? Just, all sorts of things that we have to look at. Okay, so throughout this entire hour that I've been talking about this, what we need to know is there were many different times in American history from 1865 where we had chances to stop some of the more egregious of the blatant racism that was separating Black and white Americans. We had so many chances, but it's going to take a very long time, and we're not there yet. We still see that. I didn't want to come up right up to the present because that's current events, but we are talking about things today in the year 2021 where we have seen movements that have taken people to the streets to protest. And remember, I said earlier, regarding something else, sometimes fear kind of manifests itself with violence. Okay, sometimes people who are frustrated and don't really know where to turn are going to act out. And sometimes it seems like you can't understand why that would happen. But look at history and look at the history of Black Americans and the way that racism has dug its way down, starting with the dehumanization of Africans coming over as slaves back in the 1600s, when slavery became perpetual. Okay, no other group of Americans have ever been slaves in the United States. Okay, so appreciate your listening to me for this long, if you're still here, and thank you. And go out and pay attention to history and pay attention to the world.